Okay, good morning everyone. We're on DAF Yud Zayin Amud Aleph, and we learned yesterday that there are certain lands which were identified by the Gemara where there is a presence of the remnants, the descendants of the 10 lost tribes, such that Rav Asi was quoted by his disciple Rav Yehuda as saying that if a woman receives Kiddushin from a heathen in one of those lands, you have to be choshesh that the Kiddushin is from a Jew, and therefore she's Safek Mikudeshes. She would need a get from that fellow, it seems like. So the Gemara now says, Amar Rabbi Yochanan added to that, and he had said, this is the fourth line of the Gemara, the Kulan Lipsul. Not only do you have to worry that maybe they're married to a Jewish man, even though the guy presents himself as a heathen, but you also have to worry that the guy's a mamzer, because the 10 lost tribes intermarried, they married incestuously, and so there could be mamzeris there as well. Ki amrisa kamei de Shmuel amar li. So Rav Yehuda now says, so this is all what my Rebbe Ravasi said. I then presented what Ravasi said to Shmuel when I went to learn under Shmuel. And Shmuel said to me, Amar le bincha haba min Yisraelis kari bincha ve'in bincha haba min averis chachavim kari bincha ela binah. So Shmuel says, I'm sorry, but I disagree with Ravasi. You don't have to be choshesh that there are Jews in these lands, because even though the 10 lost tribes were deposited in those places, but because they intermarried and the men married non-Jewish women, the children, the offspring, we go after matrilineal descent. And because the women that they married were not Jewish, then their children are not Jewish. Now, how do we know this? What is the source for the halacha of matrilineal descent? So Rashi tells us it's based on a pasuk of Ki Yasiris bincha me'acharai. The Torah says, "Es bitcha lo sitein livno, uvito lo sikach livnecha," that do not give over your daughter to an idolatrous person to marry, and do not take a daughter of his to your son. And the reason is, says the Torah, Ki Yasir, because he will turn your son away. Now, when it says he and not she, that implies that only when the father is a heathen will he turn away your son, which implies that if it's the opposite, where the woman is not Jewish, then the offspring of that union will not be Jewish. It won't be bincha, it won't be your son anymore, or your grandson in this case. So therefore, that's how we know that only when the father is a goy and the mother is a Jew, the grandchild is still called bincha. But if it's the opposite, if the mother's a non-Jew and the father's a Jew, it's not called bincha anymore. Whatever child they have is not your child. So that's how we know that we go after matrilineal descent. And therefore, Shmuel's argument is, you don't have to worry b'choshesh for kiddushin because everyone's a goy by now. Frek the Gemara v'ha'ika banos. But one second, what about the Jewish women from the 10 lost tribes who married goyim? That we see from the pasuk that if you have a grandson that is born to your daughter, even though the father is a goy, that's still called your offspring, so the child is Jewish. Don't you have to worry about the child being Jewish in that situation? So Gemiri de binta de'ahu dara itzdaruya itzdaru. The Gemara answers no. You know why? Because we have a tradition that when Sancherib scattered the 10 lost tribes in these locations, all of the women of the tribes, their uteruses burst. If not all of them, but many of them. And they were therefore rendered infertile. Why that happened or how that happened, we don't have enough information. It could be it was just a divine miracle to prevent the 10 lost tribes from growing further in the diaspora. Or, I don't know what the other explanation could be, but the bottom line is that they no longer were able to reproduce, and therefore whatever children were born from the 10 lost tribes were from the men and not from the women, and since they married non-Jewish women, the children are not Jewish. Ika da Amri, others learn, Ki Amrita Kamei di Shmuel Amrli, Lo Zazu Misham Adsha Asum Ovde Chachavim Gemurim. That others learned that what Rabbi Yehuda said is that when I presented this problem of the women marrying non-Jews and having to be choshesh, that maybe they're from the 10 tribes, he said to me, no. At some point earlier in history, the rabbis made an edict that they have the definitive din of non-Jews. Shenamar, as it says in the pasuk in Hosea, Bashem Bagdu Kivanim Zorim Yoladu, that they rebelled against Hashem because they gave birth to foreign children, meaning the children that the 10 tribes gave birth to are no longer Jewish. And that's the decree, regardless of whatever svar you're going to say, that they have the status of Goyim. Yosef, Rav Yosef, Achuri de Rav Kahana. Rav Yosef was one sitting behind Rav Kahana. V'Yosef Rav Kahana kamed Rav Yehuda, who was sitting in front of Rav Yehuda. The Yosef Ka'amar, and he heard him seated and reciting the following halacha: Asidon Yisrael da'avdi yomatava ki charvi tarmod. We remember we learned yesterday that one of those places where you had to worry about people who were not miyuchasim, people who were of ill yichus, that they had to be, either they were mamzerim or they had some other taint in their family line. One of those places is called Tarmod. And the rabbis will make a great celebration when the city of Tarmod is destroyed, because that will also represent an uprooting of all of those people of questionable lineage within Klal Yisrael. So frak the Gemara v'hachariv. But we know that it was the city was already destroyed. The Gemara says no, it wasn't, because hahi tamud avai. The city that you're thinking of is Tamod, not Tarmod. Now, there's something obviously deeper here that I don't know what it is, but you have to know that there's something deeper. Rav Ashi Amar Hainu Tarmod Hainu Tamod, and Achpulehu Demichbal Charav Mehagisa Esav Mehagisa Vicharv Mehagisa Osiv Mehagisa. Rav Ashi says no. Tarmod and Tamod are two different places. Are the same place, rather. They are the same place. But when you heard that Tamod was destroyed, it was only destroyed on one side. And whatever part of the city was destroyed, they rebuilt it up on the other side. So if it was destroyed in the north, they rebuilt it in the south. It was destroyed in the south, they rebuilt it in the north. But the bottom line is that even though there was some kind of weakening of this city of ill repute, nevertheless, it's still around. Yosef Rav Hamnuna kamei de'ula v'kahavi b'shmaita. So Rav Hamnuna was sitting in front of Ula and was asking a lot of kashas about this whole teaching about people who come from Tarmod are of ill lineage. So Amar Mar Gavra Uma Guvre Ilav de Harfanya Mose. So Ula starts to get suspicious. He says, why are you persisting in your questioning of these ideas? You must come from the town of Harfanya, which is adjacent to Tarmod. And therefore, just like Tarmod is a city of questionable yichus, so too is Harfanya. So that must be why you're so bothered by this whole discussion. So the Gemara now says, Ichsif, Rav Hamnuna became very embarrassed because he realized that his persistence in questioning incriminated him and incriminated his family line. So Amar Lei Kesef Gulgalta Lehecha Yahavis. So Ula tried to console him. He says, let me ask you something. You live in Harmanya, right? So he says, yes. Now, but there are different districts in Harmanya. Who do you pay your taxes to? So Amar Lei Lefum Nahara. I pay it to the town called Pum Nahara, which was on the mouth of the river. That's literally what it means. So he says, Amar Leim Kain Mupum Nahara At. So therefore he says, so no, don't worry, you're not considered to be a resident of Harfanya, you really belong to Pum Nahara. It's like a guy who lives on Bathurst and Steeles. So they ask him, okay, do you pay taxes to the city of Toronto? Then you're from North York. If not, no, he says, I pay my taxes to the city of Vaughan. Oh, so don't worry, you're a Vaughanite, you're not a Torontonian. Don't worry, you're okay. Right? That's basically what he was telling him. So the Gemara, and therefore you don't have, your yichus is not under question. So the Gemara now says, "My Harfanya." Why is this town of ill repute called Harfanya? Amar Abzeira Harsha Hakol Ponimbo. It's a contraction of the words. It's a mountain, which means it's an elevated place that everyone turns to. What does it mean that they turn to it? It means that if you come from bad yichus, such that no one wants to make a shidduch with you, so you know there's always a place where you can go somewhere out in the Wild West where people don't care about yichus, and you'll be able to find a shidduch there, right? I'm sure that's. I won't make any social commentary. But Masnisa Tana Kol she'ein makir mishpachto v'shivto nifna l'sham. The Brisa says that anyone who doesn't have clarity on his family line, he would go to Harfanya because no one else would want to touch him. So Amar Rava v'hi amuka misha'ol. But Rava says, but nevertheless, even though we just called it a mountain, it is deeper than Sheol, which is another word for Gehenna. Shenamar miyad Sheol eftemi maves egaleim v'ilu pasul didu les lehu takanta. He says, because after all, the pasuk by the Sheol says that God says you'll have redemption and salvation from the Sheol eventually. But when it comes to bad yichus, there's no redemption or salvation. You got to live with it permanently. So therefore, it's worse. But Gemara is basically essentially saying that bad yichus is worse than being in Gehenna. So pesule da harfanya mishum pesule de mishon, and the Gemara just clarifies that how did the people of Harfanya develop that bad reputation? Because they were adjacent to Mishon. Upsule de mishon mishum psule de tarmod. The people of Mishon were adjacent to Tarmod. And Upsule de Tarmod mishum avdei Shlomo. And the people in Tarmod goes back to the times of the servants of Shlomo, like we learned yesterday, that because of their affluence, they passed themselves off as Jews. They married Jewish women, even though they themselves were not Jewish, and as a result, their children became mamzerim. That's the way the Gemara had explained it, because this Gemara is going according to the Shita that if an Eved has relations with a Jewish woman, the Vlad is a mamzer, which of course we don't paskin like. But in any event, that's why the lineage of these people was always put under question, and it almost sounds like you went out into the suburbs to try and escape the bad name, but the bad name followed you because everyone else went out into the suburbs as well. And that's where people get this saying, that whether it's a large measure or a small measure, things that are heavy eventually roll down to the Sheol. But there's even things deeper than the Sheol, so that things will roll down even further from the Sheol down into Mishaol Tarmod, Umitarmod Lamishon, Mimishon Laharfanya. That, they keep rolling down, down, down until you get to the bottom of the pit, which is Harfanya, which is where all these people live. I don't know what the rabbis had against the Harfanyites, but I'm sure when they read this, they were not happy.
Vegas.
Yeah, almost. It sounds almost like Vegas.
Yichus is one of the foundation.
It is. It's a very important foundation. We'll see when we get to Kiddushin. The fourth parak of Kiddushin is all about Yuchsin. Okay, Hadron Alach. Didn't it say that
10 tribes there's a special river that's throwing stones on it all the time, but no one can go?
There are various midrashim about the Sambatyon River and all of these other places where the 10 lost tribes have gone to. The question is, do you take it literally or not? Because some of them are very fanciful. Okay. So now the Gemara says, let's examine the case of Eishesach Shalohaya Ba'olama, which is one of the 15 women who does not fall for Yibum, in a case where the brother who was proposed for Yibum was not alive when the widow's husband passed away. Shnei Achem Umeis Echad Mehen V'nola Lahen Ach V'achar Kach Yibum Hasheni Es Eishes Achiv. So the first, we spell out the case. We have Ruvain and Shimon. Ruvain's married to Rachel. Ruvain dies. And then Levi is born after Ruvain dies. Shimon then does Yibum to Rachel. And then Umes. And then Shimon dies. Well, by virtue of the fact that this woman was the widow originally of Ruvain, who was Shalohaya Ba'olamo, who Levi never met, therefore, this woman retains a permanent stigma of Eishesach Shalohaya Ba'olamo, so that even though Shimon did Yibum with her afterwards, that stigma remains, and she does not fall to Yibum for Levi. So Harishona Yotza Mishum Eishesach Shalohaya Ba'olamo, and therefore this woman Rachel, who we call the first wife, does not fall to Yibum to Levi. Behashniya, and if Shimon has a second wife, then Mishum Tzarasa, then she also does not fall to Yibum because of a Tzaras Erva. And then the Gemara talks about this phenomenon called Maimer. Now, I don't know if we've really seen the discussion of Maimer yet, but what is a Ma'amar? Now, the only way to fulfill the mitzvah of Yibum is through Bia, is through physical consummation of the relationship between the Yavam and the Yavama. What would happen, now normally in a normal marriage you can present a woman a shtar or kesef. Those are the other two methods of normal marriage which do not work by Yibum. If a man acts as a Yavam and gives a woman a wedding ring, does that mean they're married? No. But the Rabbanan came along and said that if he does that, then midrabbanan she's considered to be married to him, such that the other brothers are precluded now from Yibum and Chalitza. Okay? So just keep that in mind, and we'll learn more about this concept of Maimer later. It's a rabbinical marriage of Yibum. So basically, he gives her a ring instead of consummating it physically. So if Shimon does that, and then Shimon dies, what's the question about Levi? Well, we know that Levi can't do Yibum with Rachel because the question is on the other wife of Shimon. Since she's not really a Tsaras Erva because Shimon was never biblically married to Rachel, to the Eshes Ach Shelo Bolamo, so then the Tzara of Shimon really does fall to Yibum for Levi. But Midrabanan, she is a co-wife of Rachel, of an Eshes Ach Shelo Bolamo. So since Midrabanan, she's a Tsaras Erva, Midraisa, she's not a Tsaras Erva, therefore Levi has to give her Chalitza, but he can't do Yibum. Let's take a look at the Gemara. Amar of Nachman, mandatani rishona lo mishtabesh, mandatani shniya lo mishtabesh. He says there are two versions of our Mishnah. Some say that when we're talking about Rachel, the question of doing Yibum between Levi and Rachel, and we said that the Rishona does not do Yibum, some have the gears of calling her the Rishona, the first wife, and some have the gears of calling her the Shniya, the second wife. Mandatani Rishona lo mishtabesh, my Rishona linafila. The reason why we call her the first wife is because she first fell for Yibum even before Levi was born. And then she falls to Yibum a second time, but since she fell to Yibum before the other wife of Shimon, we call her the first one. So, Umandatani Shniya lo mishtabesh, my Shniya linisuyin. But if your gears of the Mishnah is to call Rachel the second woman, what we mean by saying is the second woman is that Shimon was married to his other wife before Rachel fell to him for Yibum. So that's why we call her the second wife. In other words, Shimon had two wives. His first wife, which he married from the Shuk, and then the second wife that he did Yibum with, and that's why she's called the second wife. So the Gemara now asks, well, wait a minute, Milo askinan diyiben ve'achar kach konas. But that doesn't make any sense. Who's to say the sequence in which Shimon acquired his two wives? Maybe he did Yibum first, and then he took a second wife. How do you know that the Tzara of Rachel was married first to Shimon? Maybe Shimon married her afterwards. So that doesn't make sense why you should call Rachel the second. So Elamai Shniya b'nisuin. But rather it means, why would you call her the Shniya, Rachel? It's because she's the woman who's been married twice. She was married once to Reuven and she was married once to Shimon, so you call her the Shniya, this twice married woman. And that's why we say that it would make sense to, if that's your girsa in the Mishnah, to call Rachel the Shniya.
But does the sequence of who he married first make a difference in terms of Yibum with Levi?
It makes absolutely no difference. The Gemara's question is linguistically. Linguistically, you have to justify why you would call her a Shniya. And since the sequence makes no difference, it doesn't make sense to call her Shniya unless you redefine the word Shniya as we've just defined it. So,
Levi?
no, we're not talking about Mimer now. We'll talk about Mimer later. Okay, we'll talk about Mimer later. We'll clarify. Right now, we're just talking about the first case. So now the Gemara's question is, what is the source text to tell me that if Levi was not alive when Reuven died, then there's no Yibum between Reuven's widow and Levi? Amar of Yehuda, Amar Rav, Amar Kra, Ki Yeshvu Achim Yachdav. Because if you look at the story of Yibum, the mitzvah of Yibum in the Torah, in Parshas Kiteitzei, it says, when two brothers shall live together. Shahaisalem Yeshiva Achas Ba'olam. So this teaches me that they have to live together in the world. They have to be alive at the same time. Prat le'eshes achiv shalahaya ba'olamo. That is coming to exclude the case of eshes ach shalahaya ba'olamo. So yachdav, and what else does the word yachdav teach me? In other words, I guess you learn it out from the first part is ki yeshvu achim, that when the brothers live together. And the word yachdav by itself also teaches me a separate halacha, which is miyuchadim benachala. This tells me that what kind of brothers are we talking about? That they have to be designated for inheritance, that they can potentially inherit each other as kin. Prat la'achiv min ha'em, which excludes from the mitzvah of Yibum maternal brothers, because maternal brothers do not inherit each other. If one of them dies, the other brother is not subject to inheritance. So that's how we know that the mitzvah of Yibum only applies to paternal brothers and not to maternal brothers. Rabba Amar Achim min ha'av yolif achva achim b'nei Yaakov malahala min ha'av lo min ha'em afkan min ha'av lo min ha'em. Rabba disagrees. He says no. How do we know that Yibum is only paternal brothers and not maternal? It's not based on the word Yachtav, but rather based on a Gezerah Shava to the Bnei Yaakov. It says by the Bnei Yaakov, when they identify themselves to Yosef, they say, Shnei Masar Achim Anachnu, that we are 12 brothers. Okay, so the word Achim over there, it's talking about that they were paternal brothers. The 12 sons of Yaakov were not all maternal brothers, because Yaakov had 4 wives. So since they were only paternal brothers over there, so too the word Achim over here by Yibum also implies paternal. Frek the Gemara v'leilav achva achva me'arayos. But one second, the word Ach is also mentioned by one of the Arayos. The Torah says that you're not allowed to marry your brother's wife. Ervas eshes achicha lo segale. Do not expose the erva of the wife of your brother. Now there, as the Gemara will tell us, it's talking about either maternal or paternal. So if it says Ach by the Arayos, then maybe you should connect the mitzvah of Yibum to the brother that's mentioned by the Arayos instead of connecting it to the brothers of Yaakov, the sons of Yaakov. So the Gemara says, Danim Achim me Achim ve'in Danim Achim me Achicha. The Gemara says because the words are not identical. Here the word is Achim in the plural, brothers, and by the Arayos it says Ervas Eshes Achicha. Do not uncover the erva of your brother in the singular. And therefore, because you have the exact word Achim by the Bnei Yaakov, just like it says Achim here, you make the Gzerah Shava to the Achim by Yaakov, and not to the Achicha, which is written by the Arayos. But the Gemara says, "My nafkamina, what difference does that make? Just because the words are not exactly identical." Hatana deve Rabbi Yishmael b'shav hakohen uba hakohen zuhi shiva zuhi bia. Remember this famous Gemara that we've quoted several times. The Torah talks about the laws of tsaras habayis, where the Torah talks about the Kohen coming to examine the lesion on the stones of your house 2 times. The first time is the bia, uba hakohen, the Kohen shall come. And then the second time it says V'shav HaKohen, and the Kohen shall return. The Gemara makes a Gezerah Shava that it says, just like when he returns the second time, the Torah tells me that he has to scrape off the stone and remove it from the house, so too the first time he also has to scrape the stone and remove it from the house. But the point is that we make a Gzerah Shava even though the verbs are completely different. One is V'shav and one is Uba. So you see that to make a Gzerah Shava you don't have to have identical words. Sometimes the words can be somewhat different. So therefore, what difference does it make if one is Achim and the other one is Achicha? The Gemara answers, Hani mili heicha deleka midi dedamile. Aval heicha deika midi dedamile, midedamile yalfinan. The Gemara says, that's true, you can make a Gzerah Shava with words that are not identical when there's no other way to make the Gzerah Shava. But let's say I have a situation where I can take the halachos of my mitzvah in question and either compare it to Pasuk A or to Pasuk B. Pasuk A would have ramifications one way, and Pasuk B would have ramifications another way. So if one of the psukim has identical words, then I connect it to B and not connect it to A, which is non-identical. That's the Gemara's answer, and that's why if it's a question of whether Yibum is with maternal brother or paternal brother, you connect it to the pasuk that says exactly the word Achim to determine that it only applies to paternal brothers and not to maternal brothers. So now the Gemara's question is V'leilav achva achva melot dichsiv ki anoshim achim anachnu. The Gemara's next question is, well, if you're making a Gzerah Shava to wherever it says the word Achim, we also find the word Achim between Avram and Lot, where Avram says to Lot, listen, I don't want us to fight because we're brothers. Now there, was Lot Avraham's brother? No, it was his nephew. So maybe the mitzvah of Yibum applies to your nephew's wife or your uncle's wife, and not just to your brother, if you're connecting it to wherever it says the word Achim. So the Gemara says, Mistavra b'bnei Yaakov havalei lamelaf mishum demufni. Medahavla lamichtav shnei masar avadecha b'nei avinu uchesiv achim shmamina le'afnuye. So the Gemara says, no, look, you can either connect it to the Bnei Yaakov, where it's Davka paternal brothers, or you could connect it to Lot, where it's nephew and uncle. It makes more sense to connect it to the Bnei Yaakov because the word is extraneous in that pasuk. What do you mean the word's extraneous? Because since they identify them as sons of the same father, then obviously they're paternal brothers. Why did you have to add the word achim? The word achim, therefore, is coming to make a drash and make a gzeira shava. And when you have two psukim, one has extraneous verbiage and the other one doesn't, you make the gzeira shava to the pasuk that has extraneous verbiage.
In the pasuk where Avram talks with Lot, clearly it's not his brother, so it's more of a term of kinsmanship or something.
No, I understand that. We all understand that. But the point is that if you have identical words in the Torah, that's how you make a gzeira shava. So the Gemara's argument is that if the word achim is used by yibum, it should apply to everywhere it says the word achim, even when you have a nephew and an uncle situation. The Gemara says, no, that word is not mufna, it's not extraneous in the verbiage of the pasuk. So now the Gemara says, v'itzrach lemichtav achim, v'itzrach lemichtav yachtav. So now the Gemara's question is, well, you're using two words to tell you the same thing, essentially, because the word achim is what teaches you that they have to be paternal brothers, and the word yachtav teaches you the same thing, because you told me that yachtav teaches me they have to be subject to inherit each other, which only applies to paternal brothers. So why do you need two words to teach you the same halacha? I'll tell you why. The ikas of Rachmana Achim hava amina leilaf achva achva melot. Because if you only had the word Achim, then I would have thought, like Alan's arguing, to connect the law of Lot to the law of Yibum, and nephews and uncles are subject to being miyabim for each other. What about the fact that you argued v'chitema lo mufni? You said, but there's no extraneous verbiage there, so why would I make a gzeira shava? La'ayi afnuye mufni. No, indeed, there it is extraneous over there too. So kasav rachmana yachtav amiyuchadim binachala. So I'll explain to you. Really, like Alan said, it's a term of endearment, achim. So if the Torah wanted to, Avram could have said, not achim, we could have said re'im, we are beloved friends. If that's what he's just trying to show, that we are endeared to each other, the fact that the Torah uses the word achim, davka, means it's coming to teach me something. So maybe I could have learned from Lot. And therefore I need the word yachtav to teach me. No, we're referring to specifically brothers who are subject to inherit each other. Since an uncle doesn't inherit his nephew, the laws of Yibum do not apply to the two of them. So that's why I need yachtav. But why then, so just write yachtav, you don't need to write achim. Because of Rachmana yachtav, hava amina demiyachadi ba'abo ve'ima tzricha. So the answer is that if the word was only yachtav written in the Torah, I would have thought that the word yachtav means that they have to be miyuchadim, because that's what the word yachtav also could imply, that they have to be specially connected in the sense that they are full brothers both from the mother and the father. And therefore the Torah writes achim to connect it to the Bnei Yaakov, who are only paternal brothers but not maternal. But the Gemara says, but why would you think such a thing? We know that the whole concept of Yibum is based on inheritance, because the Torah says, Yakum al Shem Achiv Ames, right? That the whole purpose of Yibum is that the surviving brother will take over the estate of the deceased brother. So if the whole thing is predicated on inheritance, why would I think that they have to be full brothers both from the father and the mother? Because inheritance only works from the father. So even if the Torah would not have written, in other words, why would I think that if the Torah would have only written the word yachtav, I would have think that it applies to only when they're both paternal and maternal, if the whole mechanism of Yibum is connected to the laws of inheritance? So the Gemara says, I'll tell you why. It's the Rechsalkadai Techamina, Hoel V'chidashu, the Kamishtari Erva Gabe, Ema Ademiyachadi Ba'aba Uve'ima Tzricha. Because the whole concept of Yibum is a novelty. It's a chiddush that the Torah tells you to go ahead and do Yibum to someone who would normally be an erva to you. And therefore, I might have thought that the case is very limited. It's only when you are extremely close to that brother, because you are a full brother both from the mother and the father. Only there does the Torah permit you to do this mitzvah of rebuilding his home. So therefore, if I just had the word achim, I might have thought that it includes uncles and nephews as well. If I only had the word yachtav, I would think that it implies that only Yibum only applies to a full brother from both the mother and the father. Therefore, the Torah writes both achim and yachtav to teach me that it applies only to brothers, but you can be just a paternal brother. You don't have to be both paternal and maternal. Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rav, Shomeres Yavam Shemesa Mutter Be'ima. Next discussion. Rav Huna, quoting Rav, says that if a woman falls to Yibum, and before Shimon has a chance to do Yibum, the woman dies, the halacha is that Shimon is allowed to marry her mother. So Alma Kasavar Ein Zika. You see from here that Rav holds that this principle of Zika is not like a pseudo-marriage like we had said before. Remember we had talked about this idea that just the very fact that the woman falls for Yibum, there's this invisible tether that is created between the Yavam and the Yevama called Zika, right? Now, we said it's like a pseudo-marriage even before the man does Yibum to her, such that she can't marry anyone else. It's almost like if you marry her, you're marrying a married woman. And that's why it's an Isser Lav. But that would also imply that if Shimon doesn't end up marrying her because she dies, he would be forbidden to all of her relatives, just like a relative of my wife's relatives, my wife's aunt, my wife's mother, my wife's sister, etc. But no, comes along this Chiddush and tells me that Rav says, no, I don't hold of this tether called Zika, and therefore, as long as the Yevama dies, you can go ahead and marry her mother. It's not like you were married to her. V'leima halacha k'divrei ha'omer ein Zika. So the Gemara's question is at this point, well, if that's all you're trying to teach me, Rav, then just tell me, I paskin like the Manda Amar that holds ein Zika, because we're going to see later on, there's a machlokes on DAF Mem Aleph between Reb Yehuda ben Beseira and the Chachamim. And the case that they're going to be discussing later on is what would happen in a situation where Ruvain dies and there are multiple brothers. There's Shimon, there's Levi, Yehuda, etc. And Shimon says, you know what? I really am in love with the Yevama's sister. So he goes ahead and he gives a wedding ring, to the Yevama's sister. He says, you know what? Let one of the other brothers do Yibum. I don't need to do Yibum. I'm in love with her sister. Mm-hmm. So Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira says there's a requirement that you have to wait, that Shimon has to wait before consummating the marriage with the woman that he gave Kiddushin to until one of the brothers actually does Yibum. Because until Levi does Yibum, there's a Zika between him and the Yevama, who's the sister of the woman that he wants to have relations with. So he would be having relations almost like with an erva, like with his Zukuka's sister, if the Yibum hasn't taken place. So you see that Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira holds that this Zika creates a pseudo-marriage until it's broken by one of the other brothers doing Yibum. So therefore, you see that Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira holds Yesh Zika. That this principle of Zika treats her like you're married to her in some way, and therefore you're prohibited to her relatives until the Zika is broken. But the Chachamim say no. The Chachamim say, as long as there are other brothers that can do Yibum, then Shimon has every right to go ahead and consummate the marriage with the sister, because there is no Zika. The Zika doesn't make it like you're married to the Yevama, and therefore if you want to marry her sister and leave the Yibum and Chalitza up to somebody else, one of the other brothers, you have every right to do so.
Are you saying in this case that Kedusha would be okay? In other words,
he didn't ask us. He didn't ask us a shaila. He just wanted. We don't know. We'll talk about that later. But right now, all we know is that in the event that post facto he gave her kiddushin, we tell him wait before being koneser. Don't consummate the marriage until there's no more zika. So the Gemara's question is: if we already have this machlokes in a Mishnah between Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseir and the Chachamim, why do you Rav have to tell me in this case that if the Shomeres Yavam, if the Yevama goes ahead and dies, then you're allowed to marry her mother? Obviously, you're holding like the Chachamim who say, Ein Zika, just tell me that. So the Gemara says, I'll tell you why. Because I hava amar hachi, hava mina hani mili betrayable b'chad ye Zika. Because maybe it would have been ambiguous, because as we'll see later on, there's only this issue of there, at least according to one argument, the only time that there's a problem or that you can argue Ein Zika is only when there are multiple brothers. Because what's the rationale to say that there's no Zika between Shimon and the Yevama? Because Shimon says, because Levi could always do the Yibum, and that's why there's no Zika to me. So if I want to marry her sister, I'll go ahead and marry her. But what if there's only one brother? What if there's only one surviving brother? Maybe you would argue that in that case, there is a Zika, even according to the Chachamim. So therefore, Rav has to clarify that even if there's only one surviving brother, if the Shomeres Yavam dies, he can marry her mother. So frak the Gemara Velema halacha kedivrei haomer ein zika filu bechad. Well, then Rav could have said it explicitly. I hold that there's no zika, like the Mandarma says no zika, even when there's only one brother. So the Gemara says, I amar hachi havamina filu mechayim. Because if Rav would have said that, then that would have implied that he's more permissive than he really means to be. That would have implied that he holds that it's okay to go ahead and marry the sister or the mother of this Yevama, even when the Yevama is still alive. You know why? Because a guy has a choice of doing whatever he wants. And kamash malan la'achar misa in mechayim lo mishum da'asal levatal mitzvahs Yevamim. And that's why Rabbi has to say no. I really hold there is no zika to taint permanently this woman's relatives. But I'm not going to go so far as to permit you to marry her relatives before you do Yibam or Chalitza. Because you at least have to, there's some level of Zika. You can't just forget about the mitzvah of Yibam. So either do Yibam with this woman, or give her Chalitza. And if you give her Chalitza, it means like she's like your divorced wife, and you wouldn't be allowed to marry her mother. You wouldn't be allowed to marry her relatives. You'd have to wait for her until she dies before you can marry any of her relatives. So Tanat. So now the Mishnah says, Yevimto Shemeisa Mutter Ba'achosa. But let's see, we're going to see a Mishnah later on, and this is also on DAF Memtes. The Mishnah is going to tell us that if a Yevama dies, before you have a chance to do Yibam, you're allowed to marry her sister. So the Gemara says, Ba'achosa in Be'imalo. This is a kasha on Rav, because it sounds like you can only marry her sister, which is a woman that if she was married to you, you'd be allowed to marry your wife's sister after your wife dies. So it sounds like the Mishnah is implying that any other erva, any other relative of this Yevama, you wouldn't be allowed to marry, only her sister, because just like if you're married to a woman, after she dies, you're allowed to marry her sister, so too you can marry the Yevama's sister. But just like you can't marry your wife's mother after your wife dies, it sounds like you can't marry the Yevama's mother after the Yevama dies. So the Gemara says no. Hu hadin da'afilu be'ima va'aydi d'tana reisha ishto shemesa mutter ba'achosa ba'achosa ina vol be'ima lo da'havi lo yisura de'oraisa tananami seifa mutter ba'achosa. The Gemara says no, for stylistic reasons, the Mishnah later on talks about your sister. But because the first part of that Mishnah was talking about when you're actually married to a woman, if that woman dies, you're allowed to marry her sister, but not her mother. So therefore, stylistically, for consistency, it also talked about your sister when we're dealing with the Yevama. But in reality, once the Yevama dies, there's no connection at all to her anymore, and you can even marry her mother. But Rav Yehuda Amar, so that was Rav's halacha. But Rav Yehuda says, Shomeres Yavam Shemesa Asr. He disagrees, and he says that if a Yevama dies before you do Yibam, then you are still Asr to her mother because it was like a pseudo marriage. So Alma Kasavar Yesh Zika. So he holds that the Zika was enough to make you considered to be like you're connected to her permanently. V'leima halacha kedivrei Homer Yesh Zika. So let him just say, I paskin like Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, who holds that there is Zika. So the Gemara answer is, Ihava Omar Hachi Hava Mina Hani Mili Bechadav Al Betray Ain Zika. Because if he would have only said, I paskin that there is Zika, I might have thought maybe he only holds that there's Zika when there's one surviving brother, because there's a direct connection between the brother and the Yevama. But maybe if there are multiple brothers, he would agree that there's no Zika. So the Gemara says, wait a minute, Vahaki Pligi betray Pligi. But 1 second, the Mishnah on Daf Mem Aleph, which brings the machlokas in the first place between Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira and the Chachamim, is talking about a case of multiple brothers. That's the source case of whether yesh zika or ain't zika. So why would you think if he says I paskin that yesh zika, he's only talking about one brother? If the case that if the Tana that he's addressing is talking about two, so the Gemara says Elai Amar Hachi. So rather the Gemara says you're right, but rather if he would have just said I hold that yesh zika hava mina mechayim avala achar misa pakala zika. Because if he would have said, I hold that yesh zika, that would have implied I only hold it's usher to marry her mother or her other relatives while she's still alive. But perhaps he would agree that once the Yevama dies, maybe the Zika flies away completely. Kamash malon the Zika bichdi lo paka. Therefore, Rabbi Yehuda needs to tell me explicitly. Not only do I hold that there's Zika while this woman is still is alive, but even after she's deceased, this Yevama, the Zika remains a permanent stigma of connection, a tether between the Yavam and the Yevama, such that even after she dies, you're usher to marry her relatives as just as if she was your wife. And we'll hold it here for today.